ISIS tends to take very selectively an odd verse here and there from the writings and sayings from the times of the Prophet. The Prophet himself, as I understand, was illiterate, but those who made notes about what his sayings were led to the formal document, the Quran, which was compiled as the author has rightly brought out at the orders and instructions of the first caliph, Hazrat Abu Bakr Siddiqui, and thereafter followed through at the time of the second caliph, whose concentration more was on conquest and therefore is known historically as the man who really spread the Islamic empire from the Indus right up to Spain in many ways. But many others who subsequently came in and raised the flag of Islam were not exactly Islamic. And I think that is, it's important for us as a society which is today a model of what a multicultural, multi-ethnic society should be. And I'm very proud of that model that India is. Some of you may have seen that I aggressively stand up for India against all the negative propaganda that the Pakistanis in particular like to throw at us, primarily because they build up their thesis on a bunch of lies. I think our thesis and modern India's thesis is built up on transparency and truth. How did the ISIS come about to become a phenomena of such relevance so soon? It's important to understand that, ladies and gentlemen. It came about because the countries in the Arab world were too busy playing sectarian politics. They were supporting a group which, like in the 1980s, we saw our politicians support certain Sikh groups, which then became a Frankenstein monster leading to an assault on the Golden Temple, the Holy of Holies for the Sikh faith. Why did that happen? Because politicians here chose to use religious groups to create divide within a community. It is the same larger model that has been applied as a template in the Arab world. The Shia community is at odds with the Sunni supported Islamic State, which changed its name from Islamic State to Islamic State of Levant and back to Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and by and large is now going by the name ISIS. It is a political creation. Baghdadi, who is now claiming to be the caliph, and he expects all Muslims in the world to subscribe to his caliphate and caliphhood, is obviously living in a state of delusion. Because sensible Muslims have moved on beyond the Islam that was there 1400 years ago. I remember the words of Mahathir Mohamad, who is one of the makers of modern Malaysia, who said, if you are so hung up in the time of the prophets, why don't you go to office on camels? So I think we've got to move on. And I do not subscribe to the view that everything has been prescribed 1400 years in letter, spirit and word. You have to interpret, and therefore reading the Quran per se is a very important task that Muslims are expected to perform. But we must also read the interpretations of the Quran and what the Prophet said, because there is a view that whether the Quran was written in Arabic or Aramaic. If it was written in Arabic, it is the interpretation some of the harsher elements draw from it. But if you go to the other script, which was also prevalent at that time, it was Arabic. And that is a much milder, softer tone. Also in the time of the Prophet, two phases went through in his life. One was the phase when he was trying to promote the religion and he came under a lot of opposition in Mecca. When he moved on into a more secure environment and created his community in Medina, he became much more accommodative of various tones and spirits and cultures that existed around him, including the Jews, who were his greatest friends and supporters for a long time. It is one of the ironies that the Anglo-Saxon world was the one which was after the Jews for a long time. And if you want to know how it feels to be a Jew in that time, look at the famous Oscar-winning film Chariots of Fire. But more importantly, the Jews today are at odds with the Islamic world because of a certain creation that came out of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So the Islamic world is really what we see as the Islamic world, but there are more Muslims outside the so-called Islamic world than there are in the Islamic world. Look at model states like Malaysia, Indonesia. They are also Islamic and they get on with their business pretty well without wielding swords. So why do we have to take the model only of the Islamic world that exists in the Arab world? There is the terminology they call Jahiliyyat. And I think it does apply to ISIS and many others who are still Jahils. Because Jahils are people who are unaccommodative, who are dogmatic, who are unable to accept any other culture, any other way of life except theirs. The ISIS ran into good luck because of the politics the Prime Minister of Iraq played, Mr. Maliki. He did away with the military leadership of Iraq, so Iraq's military was waiting to be hammered. And the ISIS went and hammered them and took over Mosul and Tikrit and other towns and took over $500 billion worth of money, which they were flushed with cash. But look at one of the recent issues of The Economist. The ISIS's ability to churn out oil and produce money has gone down by more than 70%. Its ability to attract loyalists is also going down. And the handful of people from India who are going, I'm sorry, they will continue to go, because as the book rightly brings out, on one side it says India's intelligence agencies are alert to what the ISIS is doing in terms of social media propaganda. But on the other side, it also brings out that our intelligence agencies are incapable of reading or understanding Arabic and various other Middle Eastern languages through which this social media propaganda is happening. I don't think that's true, but even if it's true, then we need to get our act together and stem the tide. And I think a handful of people, one of the facts that doesn't come out in this book also is that in India, Muslim groups, though there are hardline elements and they'll be even in the United States, so why not in India? That's a much more modern society. And more people are being picked up from Western universities who are scholars and are becoming bomb engineers for Islamic groups than they are being picked up from India, except by the one chap from Bangalore who became part of that attack on Glasgow airport. But the fact of the matter is that these Islamic groups, they cannot connect with all of India, because Muslims in India live in pockets. They don't live like Pakistan, right across the board from North to South Pakistan. That's why the Al-Dawa school is such a successful experiment of the Lashkar-e-Toiba, which has thousands of students who are potential recruits for hardline groups. We don't have that. All we have to do is become a little more alert to monitoring trends and activities and where funding goes. But I think, the map that is shown, this is the delusion that ISIS is living in, that we get into Khorasan one day, which includes India. But I'd be very, very surprised if they get anywhere close to taking over India. It's a ragtag army. You can beat the Iraqi army, which had no officer leadership, so the Iraqis ran away. Try taking on the Indian army and you'll get a bloody nose. Okay? So please understand that this country is not up for grabs, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the central point I want to bring out. Also, I want to bring out that the author has obviously an intellectual agenda to follow. It becomes very obvious when reading the book, because the book is clearly following a very right-wing line. But there was a moderate line in India and Islam. Islam did not, ladies and gentlemen, come to India with the sword. The sword only bought killing, plunder and loot for the rulers who came. Islam came to India through the route of Sufism. And Sufism's color is saffron, it is not green. So please understand that Islam in India spread because the message of various great philosophers, thinkers, writers, who as much as today's Swamis were peers of those days. They were the same people. And therefore India's Islam is very different from the Wahhabi Islam that the Saudis and others push for. And if we take enough measures and ensure that those guys who go to Saudi Arabia and come back indoctrinated to try and further indoctrinate India, and it's been in the news, the IB has highlighted the fact there have been more than 12,000 clerics who come back from there with some kind of funding and indoctrination and trying to talk to about 1.2 million Indians in various mosques. We must curtail those sermons. Freedom of religion does not mean that to challenge the very constitutional ethic on which the nation is based. Up to a point you can draw a line. So I think we need to, this book certainly does highlight a few facts. For example, no Islamic caliphate was a sort of a golden rule, a golden era of Islam as people were made to believe. Because many caliphates, and starting from the time of Muawiyah onwards, the Islamic caliphs not only made it monarchical rule, which the Prophet was against, otherwise he would have made Hazrat Ali his successor, who was his brother-in-law and his son, who was his cousin and his son-in-law, but he made another elder who was also a relative his successor. And their subsequent successors till Hazrat Ali's turn came were older and in their own way reasonably accomplished. So Islam was meant to be a meritocracy. Islam has been destroyed by those who talk of monarchy. And Saudi Arabia sits as the champion of the two mosques, but they are at the heart. Even today, the new Saudi king that has been appointed is still a son of King Al Saud, who created Saudi Arabia, 67 years ago or whenever. So the fact of the matter is that a lot of things that we see about Islam, while this literature brings out one sort of experiences, we need to understand that there is a lot more to the religion, lot more to the philosophy that is accommodative of other religions. It is not a religion of violence as has been seen and projected. It must be understood as such. The second thing that which is very important also to understand, that in Islam, people have inherited a Muslim name, have inherited a Muslim tradition only in as much as the cultural edifice of that, not the tradition of the life of the Prophet. A simple example is, Prophet talked about living a humble and a modest life. These caliphs finally veered into complete debauchery, complete, a level of lavishness that Islam never prescribed. So when the caliphate collapsed, and even before that, certain caliphs were tied to the rods and tied to a pole and beaten in front of the public by rods by conquering rulers. So Islam has been completely misrepresented by those who claim to represent Islam. And if this book gives that account, good for it. But I think the book ends up painting a one-sided picture. So therefore, with due respect, I don't agree with the author's thesis. But I do compliment the author to put together such a deep and research document. But in as much as there is volume of information available about the excesses committed by Islamic rulers, there is also a volume of evidence of the good work done by people who work for social harmony, peace, etc. The Moghla rebellion in Kerala notwithstanding, the excesses of sultans notwithstanding. All that is brought out. I think it's very important to understand, because you see, for instance, in one place he says, he's quoted a Maulana Azad, who at least I understood as a person to be a relatively sensible person. I got 3 minutes, I know. And he's quoted Maulana Azad to say that he was an extremist with extremely fanatical views. I think it doesn't come out in the rest of Indian history. So if it was there, I think more of Indian history needs to address that. He's also talked about the fact that how Gandhiji supported the Khilafat movement, which laid the foundation of the process of partition. Narendra Singh Sarila and various other authors who talked about the whole thesis of partition would argue otherwise. They say it was the British initiative in which Jinnah became a pawn at the initiative of Aga Khan to create a buffer state against the Soviet expansion through Afghanistan, and that buffer state that was to be created in what is now the Afghan region was to be the basis of Pakistan. Eventually, Radcliffe drew lines and we ended up having a Pakistan of the size that we had.